Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah Daf Tet. The next 6 weeks of the learning are dedicated to Susan Silks, Shana Blima Bafegel, for a refuah shlema from her loving and adoring friends. Susan, you're the absolute epitome of Yahavta l'reacha kamocha, always putting others' needs first. Besides being a super bike rider, swimmer, challah, and chocolate chip cookie baker, you also started learning Daf Yomi with Hadran just a few months ago, taking on yet another new challenge and finding the daf so meaningful. We have no idea how you managed to fit so many of us into your life, but we are so blessed that you do. Chodesh Tov Malei Briut, Refuah, Ve'Noam Hashem. Today's daf is sponsored by Gita and David Neufeld in honor of their first year Aliyah anniversary. Ki tovat haaretz me'od me'od. Okay, we are going to get started. Today, I will warn you, is a bit of one of those complicated numerical dapim. Okay, quite a different daf than what we're used to. For that, there's a study guide, so I recommend you use it, and I will share screen for those on the Zoom and for those watching on YouTube. Okay, we started with yesterday the 120 years that we saw, the 120 years, the 180 years that the Romans ruled, right? And we had this story that really preceded all that, which was that the Jews helped the Romans, according to the story we read yesterday, conquer the Greeks. The Romans couldn't conquer the Greeks until they joined forces with the Jews. And on account of that, for the first 26 years that the Romans ruled, the Jews ruled with them, or at least they were in some sort of pact together. And then only after that did they start ruling the Jewish people in a very, more difficult manner, and we became somewhat enslaved to the Romans. And that was and now we're going to talk about those numbers. Really, we want to figure out, where do we know about these 26 years that preceded the whole thing? And for that, we brought the statement of Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yossi, who brought Rabbi Yossi's Torah before his death. They said, tell us something your father said. And he gave this whole numerical count of different years before the destruction of the temple. And he said 180 years, and that's the one that's important to us right now. The rest of it we kind of dealt with yesterday and put aside, but the main central issue was 180 years before the destruction, the Romans ruled over the Jewish people. Now, right, and they called it Malchut Risha'ah, meaning, and it wasn't very good. So now we're going to go to the very bottom of Chenim Bet and figure out the numbers, and from here get to the 26 years. Shmonim Betulo, wait a minute. The Romans only ruled for 180 years and not more. And what we're basically going to show, this isn't, usually when they ask that kind of question, it's like, there's a difficulty. They don't really mean this is a difficulty. They mean this as, well, it was actually more than that, and that's going to prove that the more than that was the extra 26 years of which the Romans were with the Jews, together and not against the Jews. So that's what we're going to get to. So now they're going to say, Bahatani Rabbi Yossi Berebi. Now, Rabbi Yossi Berebi is actually Rabbi Yossi ben Khalaf, who's the father of Rabbi Shmuel. He's called Berebi, like as maybe a sign of greatness or something. It's not like he's the son of Rabbi. No, it's just Rabbi Yossi the Great, which is Rabbi Yossi ben Khalafta, who is the one who was quoted here. And he says, okay, now I'm going to start with sharing my screen. And I'm going to basically share my screen through almost the whole shiur. Okay, here we go. Here are the different kufot of Bayit Sheni, Senket temple period. Okay, and here comes Rabbi Yossi, and he explains, here are the numbers. Malchut Paras Bifnei Abayit. We're really on the second column here from the right. Okay, Paras, Yavan, Kashmonai, Hordus. Then we'll go to the sides a little, but I kind of tried to organize this in a particular way. For me, it was visually helpful. I hope it'll be visually helpful for you. Malchut Paras Bifnei Abayit 34 Shana. So the Persians ruled the first 34 years of the Second Temple period. Malchut Yavan Bifnei Abayit 180 Shana. The Greeks 180 years. Malchut Cheshmonai Bifnei Abayit. Now what you have to understand is we're going to have the Cheshmonaim, the Hasmoneans, and Hordus, Herod. But those two together, because remember, who defeated the Greeks? The Romans. So the two together are going to be the Roman time period, and you're going to see immediately it's not 180 years. Malchut Cheshmonai Bifnei Abayit 103. Malchut Beit Hordus 103. So each of those two reigns of the Hasmoneans and Herod were 103 years. Altogether, right, 206, not 180. You can already start doing the math, right? 26 plus 180 is 206, and that's what appears here on the more left-hand columns of that, is just putting this together. This is all Romy, that's all the way on the right. So Roman, altogether 206, which is 26 plus 180. Okay, and that's going to prove our point. We just have to read a little more to see the Gemara prove it, but we've already shown. So now they say, Mikan va'elach, say v'chashov kama shanim achar churban habayit. Now, what he's trying to say in the statement, not relevant for our 26 plus 180, is from then on, okay, by the way, I did the total, which is 420 years. We'll come back to this number later. The whole Second Temple period, according to this count, okay, I'm going to be very clear here. This isn't necessarily historically, it doesn't correspond to the numbers that we know of the Second Temple period, okay, because it was more than 420 years. But that's the way the rabbis counted it, and that's what we're going to go with because we're in the rabbis' count. Okay, we're not talking about here historical accuracy. Now, from then on, okay, what people started counting from the destruction of the temple. Okay, so this is all about really calendars, how people counted years. Okay, how people wrote, and we're going to get to documents today. How people wrote in documents, right? So some people wrote from the Persian rule, from the Greek rule, from the Roman rule, from the structure of the temple. And what they're saying here is after that, many people really started counting from the destruction of the temple, which basically means that after 420 years, they started from zero. Okay, and then it starts counting from zero. Wait, we have, BCE and CE, right? There were all sorts of incidences that caused different people to start counting their calendar. Oh, now we're really starting, right? So this is what we're having here. Now, anyway, back to our main topic, because that was all a quote of Rabbi Yossi. Alma matayim b'shit havu. So now you see there were 206 of the Roman rule. Va'at amart 180, but wait, but didn't you say it was 180? Ela must be esrim v'shit shnim kamu b'hem nutayu b'hadei Israel. For 26 years they were steadfast with the Jewish people, meaning they had a good relationship. V'lo ishtabudei bahu, and they didn't subjugate the Jews underneath them. V'amtulahachi lo kachashiv lehu kishapashtal malchut harisha'ah Yisrael. And when they said when the malchut harisha'ah took over Israel, that was 180 years after the 26 years passed, and there's your proof. Okay, we could have ended everything here and it would have had a much simpler daf. But Rav Papa decided to make things a little complicated. I'm a Rav Papa. He was actually trying to make things helpful, but makes our job a little bit complicated. Now, he says, Itae haitana velo yada prate kamahave. If you have a Tana, and this doesn't necessarily mean a Tana specifically, like someone from the Tanaitic time period, he seems to mean a Talmid Chacham or even just a person, and you want to know how many years after the destruction, because that's what we said right now. From now on, we count from the destruction. But let's say you don't know how many years from the destruction. Now he says, Lo yadak parte kamahave. Parte means like the tens and the single digits, really. And we're going to basically, and I had trouble showing this in my page. If I had time for a Canva, maybe I would have done it a little differently. But in all of our counts now that we're going to have a whole bunch of counts. We're going to ignore the 100 digit because the point is, let's say you're okay. Here, I gave my example. If we're 240 years after the destruction, you know that you're within 200 years after the destruction. You know the century. You don't need to calculate the century. Everybody knows we're 200 and something years after the destruction. We assume people know that. But what don't you know? The 40. Okay, now the question is going to be, if we're standing today and it's 240 years after the destruction, how will I, and I don't know exactly how many years after the destruction, I know it's 200 something, I don't know exactly how many, how will I get to that number 40? Okay, that's what Rav Papa is going to help us figure out. That's why I said in the end, he's trying to help us, even though he's complicating our lives by having to figure out what he means. Lishayle lesafre kamakativ. Ask a sofer what he writes in his documents. Now, the Sofrim wrote according to the Greek. Okay, the assumption is we're talking about scribes that use the Greek count from the Greek's rule. And this is why all the way on the left of the first chart, which we didn't address yet, it shows how many years from the Greek's rule till the destruction. Okay, so if you look, you have, right, they ruled for 180 years. The Romans then ruled for 206 years. That gets you to 386 years. But we're not going to use the number 386. We're going to use the number 380. That you're going to see further on, but not today. But the Greeks first took over only in Elam, another word for Babylonia or near Babylonia. And they didn't take over they didn't have a huge, they didn't conquer everything yet until basically 6 years later. So the count that they count from the Greek rule starts 6 years into the Greek rule, according to the count we did before, 380 years. So if you're standing at year 0 at the destruction, it's 380 years to the Greek rule. Okay? So if you're 240 years after the Churban, okay, let's just forget about Rav Papa right now. Let's do the math. How many years are you after the Greek rule? So we're going to do a simple equation. 240 plus the 380 from before, that's going to get you to 620. Okay? So basically, we're 620 years from the Greek rule. That's what's important to understand now. So we're 240, right? In other words, what we're basically saying is right now I'm going to give you both numbers, and then we're going to show how Rav Papa explains how you get from one to the other, assuming you didn't know one of those two numbers. So again, if you're 240 years after the destruction, you're 620 years after the Greek rule. Simple math. Add up how many years from the destruction plus how many years from the Greek rule to the destruction, and then you have your numbers. So 620 is the Greek rule, is 240 after the destruction. So what does Rav Papa say? If you don't know the number 240, now again, we have 40 because we're going to ignore the me'ot, okay, the hundreds, the centuries. So you basically are 40 years after the destruction. In other words, you need to get to the number 40 because you know the 200. And the Greek rule is 620, which is really, if you get rid of the century, you're 620 years after, you're 20 years after, which means that if you want to get from 620 to 240 and we ignore the century, what do you have to do? Very simply, add 20 to the number 620, right? So forget 6, add 20, you get to 40. And then you know what, right, what decade and what year, what singular year you're in. That gives you your two digits of the tens and the ones, basically. Okay, so that's basically what he's going to tell us. If you don't, okay, so again, starting from Rav Papa, Itai, Haitana, Veloya, da Prate Kamahave. You're standing after the destruction. You don't know what year you're in from the destruction. Lishale l'safra kamakativ. Ask your sofer how much. The sofer will say, we're at 620. So ignore the 6. Nitfe alayu esrin shnin, add another 20 years. And now you've gotten the solution to your problem. You know you're at 40 years after the destruction. Add your 200, which you know anyway, and you get to 240. V'simanech, how do you remember this? Here's a mnemonic. This is Yaakov saying to Lavan, I've been, 20 years in your house, and that's how you remember it. Itai Safra. Now let's go the reverse. Let's say the sofer, the scribe, wants to write how many years to the Greek rule, but doesn't know that number. So what will he do? Nishayle Latana Kamachashiv. Go ask the people who keep the count from the destruction. And now we're going to obviously do the reverse. If you know 40 and you write, 240, you want to get to 620. So take 40 to 20. What do you have to do? Subtract 20. Okay? Take away 20 years, and then you'll have the resolution to your difficulty. Okay? So again, if you know it's 620, add 20 to find out what year it is after the destruction. If you know it's 240, take 20 off, and then you'll know what it is to the Greek rule. Okay? And that's all because there's 380 years from the Greek rule to the destruction, and therefore, if you're starting at 0, you're going to be off by 20, basically. Okay, and then you either add or subtract, depending on which direction you want to go in. V'simanech, and the way you remember this, now what do you have to remember? So the 20 years we had a mnemonic for, but now you have to remember who adds and who subtracts. How are you going to remember that? Here's a cute mnemonic. Safra b'tzira, the sofer shortens things, okay, lessens things, because what does a sofer do? When you want to write something, you try to write it as concisely as possible. And Tana Tosfa, and the Tana adds. Now, this could be connected with Tana often taught a Tosefta, right? The Tosefta is Tanaitic material, and there it means to add, basically. Tosefet is an addition, or maybe just Tanaim added things, okay? But if you remember those words, Safra, B'tzira, Tana Tosfa, you'll remember. B'tzira is to detract, and Tosfa is to add. Okay, that was calculation 1. Don't worry, we have lots more of these. Okay, Tana de Be'eliyahu. Now we bring a Braita. Sheshet alafim shana havi haolam. We actually learned this all in Perek Chelek, this part. There were 6,000 years that the world is supposed to last, and then remember the world is supposed to kind of be destroyed, or right? That's like the Latid Lavo. Okay, there's this understanding of these 6,000 years. Shnei alafim tohu. The first 2,000 was just tohu, like nothingness. You'll see why they call it nothingness, because Shnei alafim Torah. The next two were the Torah. In other words, everything that precedes the Torah we call Tohu, like Balagan, and not Torah organized. Shnei alafim yemot Mashiach. After the next 2,000 years were the Torah years, the next 2,000 years were supposed to be Yemot Mashiach, the days of the Messiah. Now you have to remember, these 4,000 years, okay, I'll already tell you, the destruction happened in the year 3,828, which means that the year 4,000 happened in the middle of the Amoraic period. So they already are realizing that this Yemot Mashiach that they believe is going to happen in the year 4,000 is not happening, right? Ba'avonotenu sherabu, because of all of our sins, yatzu mehem ma sheyatzu mehen. Okay, so what happened, and Yemot Mashiach didn't come. So now we're going to go back to understand the statement. Shnei alafim Torah me'emat. So these 2,000 years of Torah, so does that mean Matan Torah happened in the year 2000? Well, it didn't, okay? So what are we counting from then? Okay, we're going to see, okay, we'll get to here. I should have put it in the chart, but Yetziat Mitzrayim is the same year they got out of Egypt, they got the Torah. So, right, they got out of Egypt in Nisan, they got the Torah in Sivan of that year. That's the year 2,448. So that's not 2,000, and that's what they're going to say right now. If it's from Matan Torah to now, Lekakulehan, that's not true. Okay, we have more years than that. Okay, so, or in other words, Matan Torah wasn't at the year 2000. It's more into the next century, the next 1,000 years. Sorry. Ella. So what does it mean then? Right? So they say because if you start doing all the calculations, tre alfe parte the high alfu the have. Okay, 2,000 and more. Okay, uparte. And remember, parte are digits like tens and ones, and here it's going to even be centuries. Okay, it's a bunch of years into the next set of 2,000 years, which they don't say how many yet, but later we're going to get to this count of 2,448. So what happened in the year 2000 that we call it, this is the years of the Torah? So they say now, the Nefesh Sharasu B'Haran, that means Avram converted, right? He gets to Haran and he converts the people there. And he brings them, so to speak, Torah, right? It's not the Torah as we know it as that we got in Matan Torah, but it's belief in God and monotheism. So that's what we call the years of Torah, when monotheism is discovered basically and starts to spread. And how old was Avram at the time? According to tradition, he was 52. Okay, I stopped at a certain point. I didn't do this whole calculation, but there's a calculation you can do. In the Shanstein, for example, they have a long chart about it, which is from Abraham to, right, they go from Adam Rishon, they go all the way to, they go even farther, but, at least to Abraham at this point, like what all the years are and how we get to the fact that when Abraham was 52, it was the year 2000. Okay, they go through all the genealogies in the beginning of Sefer Bereshit and get to that. Okay, so just take it as a given right now. Avram was 52 in the year 2000. Now, Ugamire, okay, Bekama Bitran Miditane Tana. So now they say, well, how many years were missing? Arba Mea ve'arba'inu timnei shnim. 448 years were basically discrepancy between the 2,000 years when Avram converted the people until they actually got the Torah. Okay, so let's do the math. They don't do it here, but we're going to look at it. Okay, so that's what they say here. Kima ayenet be. If you look into it, okay, that's how many years you're going to get. So how do we get this? Well, Avram was 52 at the time. That was in the year 2000. Yitzchak is born when Avram's 100. So that's easy. 48 more years, you get to 2048. Yaakov is born when Yitzchak is 60. That's also in the Psukim. So that gets you another 60 years to 2108. Then Yaakov is 130 when they go down to Egypt. That's 2238. Right? You're just doing the math. And then they're in Egypt for 210 years. So that gets you to 2448. It's very simple math. Okay, if you can't do it in your head, you can look at it on the chart and calculate all these numbers, add up to that number. And there we have our number of when they got the Torah. Okay, and basically we wanted to explain was if Tana D'Bei Eliyahu says the second set of 2,000 years is supposed to be the Torah, They sort of got the Torah, but the real Torah was actually given only later. How much later? That we just explained, 448 years later. Oh, now we get to another statement of Rav Papa, just to confuse us more. So the background to this statement is we now want to figure out how much time from the okay, since we're in this 2000, 2000, 2000, if you want to calculate, okay, again, a different way of figuring out what are we counting years from, how many years are we past the year 4000? Okay, why was that important? Probably because, okay, now remember, we've been living many, many, many years without the Mashiach coming after the destruction of the second temple. But they were living soon after the destruction of the temple, and they believed that the temple would be rebuilt soon, and it was just a matter of time, and it was going to happen soon. So, and they had this understanding in the year 4000, that was when Mashiach was supposed to come, and the Mashiach would bring the rebuilding of the third temple. So it's important for them to see how many years past are we from this year 4000, because it was such a critical year that in the end, nothing happened in that critical year, but there was this hope that, that's going to happen soon. So I'm guessing I'm suggesting anyway, that could be why we're having this count that people counted from that 4000 years. So now let's go through. Yetziat Mitzrayim happens, okay? The next big number, we're looking for big numbers so we could jump ahead in history. The next big number we have after Yetziat Mitzrayim is that the first temple was built, Shlomo HaMelech, it says, when he built the temple, it's 480 years after they got out of Egypt. So that jumps you up to 2,928. It's 480 years, right? 2448 plus 480, 2,928. Then you have the destruction of the first temple. So there was 410 years till the destruction. So that gets you to 3,338. Then there was 70 years in Babylonia till they came back to Israel. That was another 70 years, 3,408. And then based on our count earlier of 420 years, it was Tkufa Bayit Sheni, the second temple period. That's another 420 years. That gets you, here's our magic number, 3,828. Okay, so the destruction happens in the year 3828. Now, until we get to the Tkufa of the Mashiach, the 4,000 years, how many years are left? That's pretty simple. 4,000 minus 3,828 is 172. So now this is important because Rav Papa comes. Now remember Rav Papa. He's going to say if you want to do your count, which last time it was the count from the destruction, this time it's going to be the count from the days of the Mashiach. Well, if you want to compare it to the Greek count, which is what the Sofrim were doing, so the Greek count was 380 before the destruction, and now we have to add just another 172 from after the destruction, okay? And that basically gets you to, if we're standing at 0 at the year 4000, basically, right? We want to start a new count. From the year 4000, it's going to be 552 years after the Greek rule, okay? So if you're standing, right? So if you're standing at the year 4000, you're basically, again, it's 380 of the Greeks before the destruction, plus another 172 years from the destruction. So you're counting backwards. At that year, you're 552 years after the Greeks started ruling. So now comes Rav Papa again, and he does his count. So let's see inside. Amar Rav Papa. If you don't know how many years we are after the year 4000, ask the Sofer how many years you're up to. Add 48 and you'll get your answer. Why 48? So let's again take an example because that was the way I found it easiest to understand this. If, for example, I just threw a number, we're 240 years after the year 4000. So how many years are we after the Greeks? So do the math. Very simple. We said 4,000 is 552 years after the Greeks. Add another 240 because we're 240 years later. You get to 792. Now, if you have the number 792 and you want to get to now how many years, what you basically want to do is get from 792 to 240. Okay, now there's two ways to do it. They're going to do it in this particular way, which is what? If you basically, they want to add instead of detract, right? The easier way I think would be to subtract 52. But instead of subtracting 52, since before we added to the Greek, we added 20, remember? So now we're going to do adding also. So again, ignore the centuries. So you have 92 and you want to get to 40, right? So what are you going to do? So you could do it, right? You could do it in two different ways. But if you add to 92, 48, okay, if you add 48, you're going to get to 800, right? If you ignore the 800, you'll get to 92 plus 48 is 140. And again, we ignore the 100, you have 40. And then you're going to know, we're in the year 240. Okay, these are just like tricks because it's not really, there's no significance to adding this number or that number. It's just, if I'm at that number, how do I do it? By the way, people do this. There's, I forget how it works, but if you want to convert the Hebrew year to the English year, right? There's like, you just have to add a few, whatever, and then you get to, I think it's like 24 or something, I forget, but you can do them. No, it's not that, but there's some, you just add a number and you get to what it is. So basically, it was like a trick to come up with how you figure it out. So again, you add 40 and then you'll know, it's now the year, right, 240. You add 48 and then you'll get to 40 and then you'll know, because you know what century it is after. So then you'll get to 240. If you know the number 240, okay, that's the next thing. So first of all, he says, V'simanech, how do you remember this number 48? Okay, again, we want a mnemonic. Turning now to Amabet, 48 48 Levite cities. If you remember that, you'll remember the number 48. Be'itai Safra. Now, if the Sofrim don't remember how many from the Greek, and they need that number, Nishale Latana Kamakatane, they'll do the reverse. They'll take away 48. So if you have 240, take away 48, you'll end up with 92. Okay, you'll end up with 192. But again, ignore the 100. You have 92. And then you'll know you're in 792 because again, you know how many centuries, and then you just figure that out. And then you'll have the answer to your problem. V'simanech, and again, how do you remember plus minus? Safra b'tzira, the sofer takes away, and Tana tosfa'a, and the Tana adds. So if you're the Tana and you have the Greek number, but you want to know your number, add. If you're the sofer and you want to know the Greek number and you know the Tana's number, so subtract. Okay, and that's how we remember. And that's why, again, that's why they did this more complicated and didn't just do it subtract from the other, because then it would have been the opposite, and that would have been already too confusing. Which time do we add? Which time do we subtract? They just make it clear cut. Okay. I hope you guys are surviving this sugya, and I hope the charts and the examples are helping you. Amar Rav Huna Bered Rav Yoshua. Okay, we have one more complicated calculation, then we have one simple one at the end. Okay. The next thing we want to figure out is, if we're already talking about calculating years and from the destruction and all that, well, another thing we like to calculate, Rav Huna says in the son of Rav Yoshua, what if you don't know what year in the Shemitah cycle you're holding? Now, this is very important for all sorts of issues. You need to know when the Shemitah year is. You need to know which year is the third and the sixth year for Maser Ani, or the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth for Maser Sheni, right? There's different things you do in different years. So you want to know what year you're in. Well, this is how you do it. Now, here we're going to have 5 stages. If I was doing this, I might have organized a little differently, the order of them, but either which way, we're going to go in the order they did so that you follow what it says in the Gemara. Now, let's say I took an example again because examples are easier to follow. It's 130 years after the destruction. Now, it's important to understand the destruction happened in the first year of the Shemitah cycle, which means the year after, year 1, is already year 2 of the Shemitah cycle. So to even it up and basically get us to starting our count from year 1, what you have to do is you have to add an extra year basically and push everything off a year. So basically, nitvecha, as if you have your 130 years after the Churban, the number you're going to work with to get to the proper calculation is actually going to be 131. Okay, because the year after the destruction was already the second year in the Shemitah cycle, we want to basically push you. We want to add one more year to get to the right number. So nitvech, I like to make a correction for that. So add one more year to your list, to your thing, to make up for that missing year, basically, right? Because you're missing the first year of the Shemitah cycle, so you want to add that. So nitvech hadsha, to add 1 year, that's your first calculation. And now you have to do 2 things, okay? And we're going to explain what we do. So then figure out how many Yovlot you have in that year. So if it's 130 years, how many Jubilee years do you have? How many Jubilee cycles? Jubilee is 50 years. We're going to see not really, but we'll start it at 50. So, because what happened? You would have 7 Shemitah cycles, 49 years, and the 50th year was the Jubilee year. Now, you figure out how many klale b'yovle, how many yovlot do you have there, okay? So, and how many centuries of Yovlot do you have, really? Right? So you have 100 years here of Yovlot. So take out 100. Okay? 100 comes off your list. You're left with 31, basically. Then you figure out Prate B'Shvue. So then you figure out how many Shemitah cycles in that 31. Okay, but we're going to do it a little bit. We have to do a little bit of something more. Nishkol mimeatre v'nishte prate. So what you do is you basically, in other words, when it says nishov klale biyovle prate b'shvue, what it basically means is separate the hundreds or things that are divisible really by 150, because it could be if we were at 170, you take away 3 yovlot, okay? But separate the hundreds from the tens and ones. Okay, so that's 131. Now, the problem is nishkol meatre mimeatre v'nishte aprate. But you have to add 2 more here. Why 2 more? Well, it depends how many yovel you have. For every yovel, you have to add another year. So for every 100 years, you have to add 2 years. Why is that? Well, that's because, okay, we're in number 4 already, okay? Because you had 131, you took away 2 yovelot, 2, which is 100. You got to 31, right? But you have to take away a year from each of the Jubilee years. So each 100 years, you have to take 2 years away and add them back in. Okay, take them away from the 100 and add them into the 31. Why? Because Rabbi Yehuda holds, okay, this is Kashitat Rabbi Yehuda, that the year of the Jubilee year, the 50th year, counts also as the first year of your next Shemitah cycle, which means that how much in 100 years do the Jubilee years take up? Actually, only 98 years, because year 50, it's only 49 and 49, right? If we were writing this, we would have just said take away, right? 49, every 49 years, just get rid of this big one, lump number. But they like to do, we've seen this many times, they like to do round numbers. So they say, oh, take out 100 and then add, right? Then take another 2 back. Okay, that's basically what they're doing. So you add another 2, you get to 33. And then what do you do? Then you divide that number by 7. Shvue is 7, usually Shavua is a week, but we talk about in the Gemara as a 7-year cycle. So since you have 33 years, now divide that into 7-year cycles. What do you get? 33 divided by 7 is 4 with a remainder of 5. So what does that mean? Now you know you're in the 5th year of the Shemitah cycle. So 130 years after the destruction is 5 years into the Shemitah cycle. Okay, you're in the 5th year of a Shemitah cycle. Okay, that was a little complicated, but again, if we quickly review, you have to add 1 year to basically make up for that missing year of the year of the destruction that was already year 1. Add 1 extra year, get rid of all the Yovlot, but for each Yovel, you have to add back in, for each 100 years, you have to add back in 2 years, 1 for each Yovel there. Add that to how many without your centuries, right? You got rid of your centuries basically through Jubilee years. And then actually, I'm thinking about it. I said 170, you would take away 3 Yovels, but I think not. I think what they're really saying is get rid of your centuries. So just take away centuries of Jubilee years. And then for each century, add back in 2 more years. So if you're 8 centuries after, right? So you're going to take away 8, take away all the 100 numbers there. Then you got rid of your 100 digit. And then you take away 8 times 2 is 16 days, right? So you add back in 16 days to whatever number you were in the 8th century, right? Let's say you were 830 years. So you'd add back in another 16 days to your 30 plus your 31 because you had that extra year, okay? And you would do the same thing for every 100 years. And then take that number, divide it by 7, and your remainder is what year you're in. Okay. Next, we're almost done with this complicated daf. So now we have the simanech. How do you remember this? What are you remembering here actually? The one thing they want you to remember is the fact that we hold like Rabbi Yehuda when it comes to the Yovel, and that you have to take away 2 you have to add back into for every 100 years you remove. Okay, so kizesh natayim harav b'kerav haaretz. Okay, that's from Sefer Bereshit, right? It was 2 years already into the land, and there's another 5 years where we're going to have more famine. Okay, that was. If you remember that pasuk about the 2 years, then you remember add back in 2 years for every 100. Amar Rabbi Chanina. Okay, this last thing, okay, there's a much more simple calculation here, but I'll leave up the sheet because I did it for you. Amar Rabbi Chanina. Achar arba me'ot lechurban habayit. Okay, now we'll talk about this in a minute, but let's just do the calculation. He says, for this 400 years after the destruction of the temple was an important year. Why? Good question. Okay, but let's just do the calculation and then I'll close the study guide. We saw that the Korban happened in 3,800, right? 3,828 in that year. At 400, you get to 4,228. Remember this number, okay? 4,228. So now the Gemara is going to say, or Rabbi Chanina is going to say, if you want to, after 400 years to Korban Bayit, there was an assumption that something big was going to happen in that year. Why? We don't know. It was a tradition they had. Now, there's something big. Either some of the opinions think it meant they thought the Mashiach was going to come, or some big great thing was going to happen, and then the Mashiach would come, and then what happens in the Mashiach time? All the land goes back to their original owners and things like that. Like it'll be okay. There's correction kind of thing. The other possibility is some calamity is going to happen and some terrible tragedy is going to happen. And therefore, either which way you look at it, whether you go with that interpretation or that interpretation, we're going to see Rabbi Hanina's advice to you, okay, some good financial advice. I know people nowadays with all the wars the recent war and this, buy stocks, don't buy stocks, all these, what you should do. Is it a good time to invest in real estate? Terrible time to invest in real estate. So that's what Rabbi Hanina is giving you some advice. When you get into that year, even if you get the best deal in the world, a field worth 1,000 dinarim for 1 dinar, don't buy it, okay? Because you're going to lose your land, okay? Either war or either, the land's just going to go back to its original owner. Now, so that got us to what year? 4,228. B'manitatan in a bright it says, if you're counting from the creation of the world, okay, by the way, I think this is I guess, right, we talked about before from the creation, about the 2,000 years and the 2,448, but here we're also talking from Briat Olam, which, by the way, notice they weren't doing in most of their counts, right? It was counting to the Greeks or counting from the Churban or counting from the 4,000 years, right? But if you're counting from the beginning of creation, and what year? Notice they say 4,231, not 228, 31. Okay, so it's 3 years off, and that's what the Gemara is going to tell us in case you didn't do the simple math, but that's the simple math. We're at 4,228, and this is 4,231. 4,231. So basically, the brightest is the exact same thing as Rabbi Hanina, with one difference. He's off by 3 years. So my Benayu, the Gemara asks, what's the difference between the bright and Rabbi Hanina? Because Rabbi Hanina didn't give a number, but we did, so we know this already. But Ika Benayu Tzlat Shanim, Demanita Tafya Tzlat Shnei. Okay, the Mishnah added 3 years to this assumption of what year is going to be the year where something is going to happen. There were 2 different versions, and there was a difference of 3 years between them. And with that, we finished our daf. So I will just, before we go to our summary, I will tell you that we're going to continue a little bit about shtarot. We're done with calculations, not to worry. We've finished all this. And then we're going to go back to the Mishnah with Ginus Yashal Malachim and things like that. And then we're going to get off on this famous discussions between Antoninus and Rebbe. And I highly recommend you listen to Alana Steinhain, who gives 3 different approaches to how to understand the Antoninus Rebbe stories that come up in our Gemara. They're fascinating stories. And she has 3 really interesting different approaches. So highly recommended to listen to. Okay, review of our daf. So actually, the review is pretty straightforward because what we did in this daf, pretty short daf, but a little bit complicated. What we did was we started with the 26 years of the Romans that they ruled together with us, or in peace, before they took over and ruled us very harshly. And we wanted to know where we get that from, and then we saw the count they have of the Korban Abayit, which again doesn't fit with our historical accounting. So again, that's a separate question. But 420 years of the destruction, and then we counted all those years, and we saw the Romans ruled for 206, not 180, but Rabbi Yossi said they ruled for 180, so they ruled harshly for 180, but the first 26 were peaceful. From there, since we already mentioned this thing about the Greeks ruling, comes Rav Papa and says, since the Sofrim, right, according to the Greeks, if you want to know from the Churban, since we know how many years from the Greeks to the destruction, and then if you want to know, you can do your calculation and figure out what year we're in from the destruction of the temple. And then if you wanted to do the reverse, you do it the reverse way. And they came up with these calculations how to do it. Then we did the same thing because we first introduced that there's these 2,000 years in the from the creation of the world. The second ones are the Torah ones. We had to figure out what does that mean, because Matan Torah happened 448 years into that. We did all the calculations. We showed how it started from Avram. Then we said, if you want to count from the 4,000 years, since that happened 172 years after the destruction, then if you count again from the Greeks, that number plus that number, and then how do you get back and forth from the Greeks to the count from the 4,000 back and forth. And again, what this really showed is the people counted, right? It's not like nowadays where we basically have, I mean, we have two calendars, really. We have the Jewish calendar and from the creation of the world, and we have the calendar of Latin or whatever we call it, the regular Gregorian calendar. And basically that's what we go by. But again, like I said, there's this, I forget what it is, but there's calculation. If you want to know which year we're in of that and which year, you can do this easy calculation that people come up with, and people actually do it today. It's the same idea exactly as what Rav Papa did here. And then we just we figured out how what year we're in the Shemitah cycle. There was another calculation for that. And we ended with, well, when you're 400 years after the Churban, you shouldn't really do any business dealings. It's not a good year or not a good time. It's unclear whether he means he says Achar Bameot. I don't know if he means exactly that year or even beyond that year, but I assume he means for a period of time. Obviously, he hadn't gotten there yet, so I think he just meant that's when this thing is going to happen, which, I don't think anything particularly happened then, though it's good to, be interesting to check if something actually happened when they believe something would happen. And with that, we finished our daf, wishing everyone a Chodesh Tov, Shavua Tov, Refuah Shlema to Susan, and again, Mazel Tov on the anniversary, Gita. And Chodesh Tov to everyone. Shabbat Shalom.